The sprawling white mansion stood proudly at the end of Oak Hill Drive, its perfectly manicured lawns and tall windows gleaming in the morning sun. For the neighbors and casual passers-by, it was a symbol of success, home to one of the city's most prominent couples, Thomas and Eleanor Richardson. On this particular spring morning, Thomas sat in his home office, reviewing the latest plans for a new shopping complex his company was developing. At 58, he still had the same passion for real estate that had driven him to build his empire from scratch 30 years ago. His steel gray hair and kind eyes gave him a trustworthy appearance that had helped him close countless deals over the years. From the kitchen downstairs came the familiar sounds of Eleanor preparing her morning tea, a routine she'd maintained throughout their 29 years of marriage. At 52, she carried herself with the polish and grace that came from years of managing their social life and organizing charity events. To the outside world, she was the perfect example of a successful businessman's wife. Elegant, charming, and always impeccably dressed. Their son James had recently taken a job overseas, something that filled Thomas with pride, even though he missed their Sunday family dinners. The framed photo on his desk showed the three of them at James's college graduation just a few years ago, all smiles and celebration. Thomas picked up the frame, his fingers tracing the edges as he smiled at the memory. What the expensive furniture, designer clothes, and social status didn't show was the growing tension beneath the surface. Eleanor's smile had become more forced at recent social gatherings, her laughs a bit too loud, her gestures slightly exaggerated. She'd been spending more time on her phone lately, quickly turning it face down whenever Thomas entered the room. During their recent dinner parties, Eleanor had started making subtle comments about Thomas's forgetfulness. She would laugh it off, but there was something calculated in the way she would glance at their guests while mentioning how he'd forgotten about lunch appointments or misplaced his car keys. Thomas had noticed these comments but dismissed them as harmless jokes, unaware of the web that was slowly being woven around him. Their household staff had begun whispering among themselves about the changing dynamics between the couple. Maria, their longtime housekeeper, had noticed how Eleanor would sometimes stare at Thomas with an unreadable expression when he wasn't looking. The gardener had overheard heated phone conversations on the terrace, conversations that would abruptly end when anyone approached. Thomas remained focused on his work, proud of the life he built for his family. The new development project would be his biggest yet. A modern eco-friendly complex that would transform an old industrial area into a thriving community space. He was particularly excited about the affordable housing component, something he wished he had access to during his own humble beginnings. Meanwhile, Eleanor spent her mornings making mysterious phone calls from the garden house, carefully documenting something in a leather-bound notebook she kept locked in her desk. She had recently started attending private meetings with people she wouldn't name, claiming they were for her charity work. The perfect life they'd seemingly built was about to crack, but Thomas hadn't noticed the first signs of the earthquake that would soon shatter his world. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the tall windows, Thomas looked out at their beautiful garden, completely unaware that every detail of his daily routine was being meticulously recorded, every small mistake noted, every moment of confusion, whether real or manufactured, carefully documented for a purpose he couldn't yet imagine. The stage was set for a betrayal that would shock their entire social circle and change multiple lives forever, but for now, the mansion on Oak Hill Drive remained a picture of success and contentment, its secrets still safely hidden behind its pristine walls. Eleanor's plan began taking shape on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while she sat at her antique writing desk near the bay window. She watched Thomas in the garden, talking on his phone about work, and felt the familiar twist of bitterness in her stomach. After nearly 3 decades of marriage, she had convinced herself that she deserved more than just being the perfect wife who stood in his shadow. She opened her laptop and started a new document, typing out perfectly normal situations, but twisting them just enough to sound concerning. Last week, Thomas had misplaced his reading glasses. In her notes, This became growing confusion about everyday objects. When he'd forgotten about a dinner with friends because of an urgent work meeting, she logged it as increasing social isolation and memory issues. Her morning routine changed subtly. She began replacing Thomas's regular coffee with decaf, knowing the lack of caffeine would make him drowsy during important meetings. When he mentioned feeling tired, she would exchange worried glances with their housekeeper, making sure others noticed his concerning changes in energy levels. During dinner parties, Eleanor masterfully planted seeds of doubt about Thomas's mental state. "Oh, darling," she would say with a perfectly practiced worried smile, "you've told that story 3 times tonight." Even when Thomas hadn't repeated himself, the concerned looks from their friends told her that her words were having the desired effect. She started recording their conversations on her phone, cleverly editing them to remove context. A frustrated comment about a difficult client became evidence of angry outbursts. When Thomas spoke about retiring someday to spend more time with family, she saved it as proof of his inability to focus on work responsibilities. The house staff noticed changes but stayed quiet. The cook saw Eleanor adding something to Thomas's food, but assumed it was the vitamin supplements she'd mentioned. The gardener overheard her crying on the phone about her concerns for Thomas's health, not realizing these conversations were carefully staged for maximum impact. Eleanor joined several online support groups for families dealing with mental health challenges. She took detailed notes about symptoms and behaviors, slowly incorporating them into her daily observations of Thomas. She became an expert at describing warning signs that weren't really there, building a convincing case that would later fool even medical professionals. She started taking Thomas to different doctors, always scheduling appointments when he was most tired, usually after she'd made sure he couldn't sleep well the night before. During these visits, she would squeeze his hand supportively while describing behavioral changes that didn't exist. "I'm just so worried," she would say, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "He's not the same man anymore." In their social circle, Eleanor played the role of the devoted, concerned wife perfectly. She began confiding in their closest friends, sharing her worries about Thomas's mental state. Each conversation was carefully planned, each concerned glance calculated for maximum effect. She made sure to be seen reading books about mental health and taking notes, building her image as a loving wife desperately trying to help her struggling husband. What no one knew was that Eleanor had already made contact with a potential buyer for their mansion, someone willing to play along with her scheme for a share of the profits. Their quick text exchanges happened late at night, when she was sure Thomas was asleep, planning how they would take advantage of the situation once her plan succeeded. As weeks passed, Thomas started feeling increasingly confused and tired, unaware that his symptoms were being carefully orchestrated. He found himself second-guessing his own memories, not realizing that Eleanor was slowly gaslighting him, making him question his own sanity. She would move his things around the house, then act concerned when he couldn't find them. "Don't you remember?" she would ask softly. "You put them there yourself this morning." The foundation was being laid for something much bigger, each small deception building upon the last. While Thomas continued trying to work and maintain his normal routine, Eleanor's web of lies and manipulation grew stronger every day, drawing closer to the moment when she would finally spring her trap. The waiting room of Dr. Mitchell's office was quiet except for the soft ticking of a wall clock. Eleanor sat next to Thomas, her hand resting on his arm in what appeared to be a supportive gesture. This was the 3rd doctor they'd visited in 2 weeks, but Thomas was too tired to question why they needed so many medical opinions. "I don't understand why we're here again," Thomas said quietly, rubbing his temples. The headaches had become more frequent lately, and the constant feeling of confusion left him feeling vulnerable. Eleanor squeezed his arm gently, the perfect picture of a concerned wife. "Sweetheart, we need to make sure you're okay," she whispered, pulling out a small notebook. "I've been keeping track of everything, just like the other doctors asked." The notebook was filled with her neat handwriting, documenting weeks of supposedly concerning behavior, most of which Thomas couldn't remember. When they were called into the doctor's office, Eleanor took charge of the conversation. She described incidents that seemed vaguely familiar to Thomas, but somehow different from how he remembered them. She talked about him getting lost driving to his office, when he'd simply taken a different route to avoid construction. She mentioned him forgetting important meetings, though he was certain he'd told her about the schedule changes. Dr. Mitchell listened intently, taking notes while Eleanor spoke. When she pulled out her phone to play recordings of Thomas's confused moments, he felt a strange disconnect. Yes, that was his voice, but the conversations seemed incomplete, somehow distorted from what he remembered. And here, Eleanor said, her voice trembling perfectly, is from last week when he couldn't remember our son's name for a full minute. Thomas frowned. He remembered that day, but differently. He'd been deeply focused on work documents when Eleanor had suddenly asked him a question, catching him off guard. The doctor performed various cognitive tests. Thomas, exhausted from another night of unexplained sleeplessness, struggled more than he should have. Simple memory exercises became challenging tasks. Words seemed to slip away from him just as he tried to grasp them. Eleanor watched with concerned eyes, documenting every hesitation, every mistake. "The symptoms you're describing," Dr. Mitchell said slowly, reviewing his notes, "combined with these cognitive test results, are concerning." He looked at Thomas with professional sympathy. "I'd like to run some more comprehensive tests, but this pattern suggests significant cognitive decline." Thomas felt the room spin slightly. "But I'm running a major development project," he protested weakly. "I just finalized the plans last week." Eleanor quickly jumped in, mentioning how the company's board had expressed concerns about recent decisions. Another detail Thomas couldn't quite remember clearly. The doctor prescribed medication that Eleanor promised to help manage. As they left the office, Thomas clutched the prescription paper, feeling increasingly disconnected from his own reality. The hallway seemed longer than when they'd arrived, the walls slightly tilted. Later that week, Eleanor arranged meetings with their family lawyer. She presented the growing stack of medical evaluations, each one building on the concerns raised by the previous doctors. The lawyer explained the importance of preparing for the future, of protecting their assets while Thomas was still able to make decisions. Thomas sat through these meetings in a fog, the new medication making his thoughts fuzzy. He signed papers that Eleanor assured him were routine, documents that would protect their future. The lawyer watched with professional detachment, noticing Thomas's uncertain movements, but seeing also the loving way Eleanor guided his hand to each signature line. At home, the staff watched with growing concern as Thomas became increasingly dependent on Eleanor. The once confident businessman now checked with his wife before making even simple decisions. His phone calls became less frequent. His business meetings were gradually canceled or rescheduled, all under Eleanor's careful supervision. The false diagnosis was now officially documented, witnessed, and legally binding. Eleanor's carefully constructed plan was moving into its next phase, while Thomas drifted through his days in a medicated haze, unaware that his life was being systematically dismantled by the person he trusted most. The morning started like any other, with sunlight streaming through the mansion's tall windows. Thomas sat at the breakfast table, struggling to focus on the newspaper in front of him. His coffee tasted different these days, but he couldn't quite explain how. The house staff moved quietly around them, casting worried glances his way when they thought he wasn't looking. Eleanor entered the dining room, already dressed for the day, her phone clutched in her hand. "Darling," she said softly, "Dr. Mitchell called. He thinks it's time we get you some more intensive help." Thomas looked up, trying to clear the fog that seemed to permanently cloud his thoughts now. "I have meetings today," he mumbled, though he couldn't quite remember the details. Eleanor shook her head, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. The gesture felt somehow wrong, mechanical, but he couldn't understand why. "I've already called the office," she said. "Everyone understands. They're worried about you too." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she'd pulled from her sleeve. The medical team is waiting for us. They're going to help you get better. Thomas didn't realize that the medical team meant a private ambulance waiting discreetly around the corner. He didn't know that Eleanor had spent weeks coordinating with a private psychiatric facility, building a case for involuntary commitment. He simply trusted his wife of 29 years when she helped him into the car. The drive felt longer than it should have. Thomas watched familiar streets pass by, feeling increasingly uneasy. When they pulled up to a gated facility instead of the medical center he expected, confusion finally broke through his medicated haze. "This isn't Dr. Mitchell's office," he said, his voice showing the first signs of real fear. Eleanor squeezed his hand, tears flowing now. "This is a special place," she explained, as two orderlies approached the car. "They're going to help you get your mind back." Her voice cracked perfectly on the last word, a performance worthy of an award. The next few hours passed in a blur of forms and procedures. Thomas tried to protest, tried to explain that there had been a mistake, but his words came out jumbled and confused, exactly as Eleanor had planned. The medication she'd been secretly giving him for weeks had built up in his system, making him appear exactly as unstable as she described in her carefully documented reports. "My wife," he managed to say clearly at one point, reaching for Eleanor as they led him away. "Please, call my wife." The staff exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen this before, confused patients not realizing their loved ones were right there. None of them noticed the brief, satisfied smile that flickered across Eleanor's face. Back at the mansion, Eleanor wasted no time. Within hours of Thomas' commitment, she was on the phone with her lawyer, activating the power of attorney she'd had Thomas sign for emergencies. She began the process of transferring assets, her voice steady as she explained that her husband's condition required immediate action to protect their wealth. The house staff whispered among themselves as Eleanor moved through the mansion, making calls and arrangements. The housekeeper, who had served the family for 15 years, finally gathered the courage to ask about Thomas. "He's getting the help he needs," Eleanor replied smoothly, but her eyes held a warning that silenced any further questions. That evening, Eleanor sat in Thomas's study, running her fingers over the smooth wood of his desk. Family photos smiled back at her, moments from happier times that now served as props in her elaborate deception. She picked up a frame holding a picture of Thomas and their son, taken at a business awards ceremony just 6 months ago. Thomas had been sharp as ever then, his speech receiving a standing ovation. She placed the photo face down in a drawer. Outside the study window, the sun set on the first day of Thomas's confinement. In his room at the facility, he lay in an unfamiliar bed, his thoughts swimming through a medicated fog, still trying to understand how his life had unraveled so completely. Meanwhile, Eleanor opened her laptop, beginning the next phase of her plan, the quick and quiet sale of their family home. The for sale sign appeared in front of the mansion without warning on a misty Monday morning. The neighbors noticed it during their early walks, and by afternoon, the local real estate community was buzzing with questions. A property of this caliber typically didn't go on the market so suddenly, and certainly not without any prior whispers in their well-connected social circles. Eleanor moved quickly, hosting an impromptu open house that same week. She walked through the rooms with potential buyers, her story perfectly rehearsed. "The medical bills are overwhelming," she would say quietly, dabbing at her eyes. "And the facility Thomas is in, well, the best care isn't cheap." The sympathy in people's eyes told her they were buying every word. The mansion, worth well over $2.8 million in the current market, attracted immediate attention from serious buyers. Local real estate agents called repeatedly, confused about why such a prime property wasn't listed through traditional channels. Eleanor deflected their questions with practiced grace, speaking of privacy concerns and the need for a quick, quiet sale. In the kitchen, the longtime cook overheard Eleanor on the phone, quoting a shockingly low price of $500,000. She nearly dropped the pot she was holding. Having worked in the mansion for years, she knew the value of the property, knew the craftsmanship that went into every detail of its construction. The price made no sense, but like the rest of the staff, she had learned to keep her concerns to herself. The buyer appeared seemingly out of nowhere, a businessman who didn't even bother to negotiate the suspiciously low asking price. He arrived late one evening, spent barely 15 minutes touring the property, and immediately agreed to Eleanor's terms. The staff noticed how Eleanor seemed to know exactly which papers to sign, almost as if the sale had been choreographed in advance. Word of the sale price spread through the community like wildfire. At the country club, Eleanor's usual lunch companions whispered behind their menus. Medical bills or not, one said, something isn't right about selling a property like that for pennies on the dollar. Eleanor had an answer for every question. She spoke of mounting healthcare costs, of the expensive specialists treating Thomas, of the need to ensure his long-term care was secured. She carried folders of medical bills, strategically letting papers peek out, all part of her carefully constructed narrative. The house staff watched helplessly as moving companies began arriving. Eleanor supervised the packing of artwork and antiques, maintaining detailed lists of items that would be sold to cover expenses. The housekeeper noticed that certain valuable pieces disappeared at night, never making it onto the official inventory. In his room at the facility, Thomas remained unaware that his home was being sold. His medication kept him too confused to ask coherent questions during Eleanor's brief visits. When he did manage to ask about home, she would smile sadly and pat his hand. "Don't worry, darling. I'm taking care of everything." The sale closed with unprecedented speed. Eleanor signed the final papers in the library, the same room where Thomas had spent countless evenings working on the development projects that built their fortune. The mysterious buyer transferred the funds immediately, no questions asked about the surprisingly low price. As the staff packed up their belongings, they exchanged worried glances. The gardener, trimming roses for what he knew would be the last time, remembered how Thomas had personally helped him plant these bushes years ago. The housekeeper lingered in Thomas's study, straightening items on a desk that would soon belong to someone else. Eleanor moved through the house like a conductor orchestrating a final performance. She arranged for the staff's dismissal, offering glowing recommendations along with carefully worded confidentiality agreements. Each severance package came with a clear message: speak nothing of what you've seen. On the last day, as Eleanor prepared to hand over the keys, she stood in the grand entrance hall. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows, creating patterns on the marble floor. Patterns that would soon belong to someone else. She smiled slightly, knowing this was just the beginning of her plan. The mansion's quick sale at a fraction of its value was raising eyebrows, but Eleanor knew that by the time anyone figured out what was really happening, it would be too late. James stepped off his international flight, exhausted from the long journey, but eager to surprise his parents. After 2 years working abroad, he couldn't wait to see their faces when he walked through the front door unannounced. He'd managed to keep his return completely secret, wanting to make it special. But the surprise turned out to be his. When his taxi pulled up to their familiar street, he stared in confusion at the mansion, his childhood home. Gone were the familiar flower beds his father had loved. The windows looked different, and a strange car sat in the circular driveway. For a moment, he thought the driver had taken him to the wrong house. There must be some mistake, he told the driver, double-checking the address on his phone. But there was no mistake. This was their address, but everything had changed. His heart racing, he pulled out his phone and called his mother. Eleanor's voice was strange when she answered, a mix of surprise and something else he couldn't quite identify. 20 minutes later, they met at a coffee shop downtown. Eleanor looked thinner than he remembered, dressed expensively as always, but something about her seemed off. She launched into an explanation about his father's mental health crisis, about the devastating diagnosis, about the necessary sacrifices they'd had to make. The house? James asked, his coffee growing cold and untouched. You sold our house. The medical bills, "Darling," Eleanor replied, reaching for his hand across the table. "The facility your father is in. It's very expensive. We had to act quickly." But something in her voice triggered a memory, the same tone she'd used when explaining away things in his childhood that hadn't quite added up. That evening, in his hotel room, James began making calls. First to his father's old secretary, then to their family lawyer, then to the house staff he'd known all his life. Each conversation added another piece to a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to complete. The former housekeeper, speaking in whispers though she'd already found a new job, told him about the strange medications, about his father's increasing confusion, about the late-night phone calls his mother thought no one knew about. The gardener mentioned the mysterious buyer who'd barely looked at the property before purchasing it. James spent hours on his laptop, researching the facility where his father was being held. He called medical friends from college, describing the symptoms that had led to his father's commitment. Their responses all carried the same note of concern. Something wasn't adding up. Using his business skills, he began tracking the paper trail of the house sale. The numbers made no sense. A $2.8 million property sold for $500,000 in a booming market. He dug deeper, looking into the buyer's background, and found layers of shell companies and hidden connections that made his stomach turn. When he finally visited his father at the facility, the meeting shattered his heart. Thomas sat in a common room, his usual sharp appearance dulled by hospital clothes and medication. But there were moments, brief flashes when their eyes met, when James saw his real father trying to break through the drug-induced fog. "Your mother takes good care of me," Thomas said repeatedly, as if reading from a script. But his hands shook when he tried to drink his water, and his words slurred in a way that had nothing to do with the mental decline Eleanor had described. That night, unable to sleep, James spread documents across his hotel room bed. Medical reports, property records, bank statements. He pinned them to the walls, connected them with strings like a detective in a movie, trying to make sense of how his family had unraveled so completely in the 2 years he'd been gone. His phone buzzed. Another message from Eleanor asking when he'd return home. But home wasn't home anymore. And as James stared at the web of information growing on his hotel room walls, a terrible suspicion began to take shape. His mother's perfectly crafted explanation had cracks, and through those cracks, an ugly truth was beginning to emerge. In the quiet hours of early morning, James sat in his hotel room surrounded by papers and laptop screens. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, but he couldn't stop now. Each new discovery pulled him deeper into a web of deception that seemed impossible to believe. His laptop pinged with an email from the former family cook, who had finally agreed to share what she knew. Attached was a video from the mansion's kitchen security camera, footage Eleanor didn't know existed. James watched as his mother carefully added something to his father's morning coffee, day after day. His hands trembled as he forwarded the video to his growing evidence folder. A knock at his hotel room door made him jump. It was a plain envelope, hand-delivered by their old gardener, who had worked at the mansion for 15 years. Inside were photos taken on his phone, screenshots of text messages between Eleanor and an unknown number, discussing the mansion's sale months before Thomas was committed. The messages were clear. This had been planned long in advance. James called the hospital where his father had first been diagnosed. Speaking with the authority of a concerned son, he requested copies of all test results. The young clerk on the phone hesitated before revealing a startling truth. Some of the original blood work showed unusual drug levels that hadn't been prescribed. Those results had somehow disappeared from later reports. His next call was to a retired detective he'd known since childhood, a friend of his father's who had always treated James like a son. Together, they traced the mansion's buyer through a maze of fake companies. The trail led to a surprising name, Robert Wilson, a man James remembered seeing at charity events with his mother, always standing just a little too close. The pieces were falling into place. Bank records showed large transfers from hidden accounts. Property records revealed plans to immediately resell the mansion at full market value. Eleanor and Robert had planned to split the profit, over $1 million each, once the dust settled. But the most standing evidence came from an unexpected source. The nurse at his father's facility, moved by James's obvious distress, shared her own concerns. Thomas's confusion seemed to peak right after Eleanor's visits. A blood test, run without Eleanor's knowledge, showed traces of drugs that weren't part of his prescribed treatment. James spread photos across his bed, family pictures from happier times. In one, taken just 6 months ago, his father stood at a podium accepting a business award, his speech clear and powerful. The man James had seen in the facility was a shadow of this confident businessman. The change was too dramatic, too sudden to be natural. His mother's own notebook provided the final proof. Found by the housekeeper in the rush to move out, its pages contained detailed notes on symptoms, medications, and their effects. Eleanor had researched everything. How to mimic signs of mental decline, which drugs would cause confusion without raising suspicion, even the best times to record his father's disoriented moments. The facility's security cameras told their own story. Eleanor's loving wife act disappeared the moment she thought no one was watching. Brief glimpses caught on camera showed her checking her phone and smiling while Thomas struggled to remember her name, a cruel contrast to her tears in public. Late that night, James received a call from his father's old business partner. The man spoke in hushed tones, sharing how Eleanor had slowly pushed Thomas's closest friends away, always with perfectly reasonable excuses. Each person who might have noticed something wrong had been carefully isolated from the situation. In his hotel bathroom, James splashed cold water on his face, trying to process everything he'd uncovered. The mother he thought he knew had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to destroy his father's life. She had manipulated everyone: doctors, lawyers, friends, even her own son, all for money and a secret relationship. The weight of evidence was overwhelming. Tomorrow, he would take everything to the authorities. But tonight, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, James had to face the hardest truth of all. The woman who had tucked him in as a child, who had cheered at his graduation, who had always seemed to be the perfect mother, was capable of unimaginable cruelty. The police station buzzed with activity on the morning James walked in with his evidence. He carried a thick folder in one hand and a hard drive in the other, containing weeks of careful investigation. The detective who met with him listened quietly, his expression growing more serious with each document James presented. Within hours, the wheels of justice began turning. Police cars pulled up quietly to the luxury apartment where Eleanor had been staying since selling the mansion. The officers found her preparing for a lunch date, her face falling as they read her rights. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled as they placed the handcuffs around her wrists. At the same time, another team of officers located Robert Wilson at his office. The man who had bought their family home for a fraction of its worth tried to run when he saw them coming. He made it as far as the parking garage before being caught, his expensive suit dusty from his failed escape attempt. The district attorney's office moved quickly, recognizing the severity of the case. The evidence James had gathered painted a clear picture of conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with 20 years of experience, called it one of the most calculated cases she'd ever seen. The most emotional moment came when medical staff at the facility began reducing Thomas's medication under police supervision. Day by day, his mind cleared. The fog that had kept him confused and compliant slowly lifted. He began to remember things, to ask questions, to show flashes of the strong businessman he'd once been. The preliminary hearing drew attention from local media. Eleanor sat in the courtroom in a modest black dress, playing the role of concerned wife until the evidence began mounting. The security footage of her doctoring Thomas' coffee drew gasps from the audience. The text messages planning the mansion's stale months in advance shattered her claims of acting out of medical necessity. James testified for hours, his voice steady as he detailed his investigation. He described finding the notebook where Eleanor had documented her deception, the bank records showing hidden transfers, the medical reports revealing unauthorized drugs in his father's system. The jury listened intently, their faces showing shock at the betrayal's depth. Former staff members came forward one by one. The cook described watching Eleanor tamper with Thomas's food. The housekeeper testified about late-night meetings with Robert Wilson long before Thomas's illness began. The gardener shared the photos and messages he'd secretly saved, knowing something wasn't right. The facility's nurse provided crucial testimony about Eleanor's visits coinciding with spikes in Thomas's confusion. Medical experts explained how the combination of drugs found in his system would have created symptoms mimicking cognitive decline. The prosecution built an airtight case of premeditated fraud and abuse. Thomas himself finally took the stand, now clear-headed enough to testify. He spoke of his gradual loss of control, of feeling trapped in his own mind while his wife systematically stripped away his freedom. The courtroom fell silent as he described the helplessness of watching his life slip away while unable to stop it. Eleanor's facade cracked under cross-examination. When confronted with the evidence of her careful planning, her tears turned to anger. She snapped at the prosecutor, revealing glimpses of the calculation behind her perfect wife persona. The jury finally saw the truth behind her mask. Robert Wilson turned state's evidence, hoping for a lighter sentence. He detailed a plan to resell the mansion, explaining how Eleanor had approached him months before Thomas's commitment with the scheme to defraud her husband. His testimony revealed the cold-hearted greed driving the entire plot. As the trial progressed, the family's lawyer worked to freeze the mansion's sale and begin recovering Thomas's assets. The property transfer was halted, the funds frozen in escrow. What Eleanor had dismantled in months would take time to rebuild, but the process of restoration had begun. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning. Justice was moving forward, step by careful step, bringing light to a darkness that had nearly destroyed a family. In the courtroom gallery, James sat beside his father each day, watching the truth finally emerge into the open. The courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to announce the verdict. Thomas sat straight-backed in the gallery, his son James beside him, both men watching as Eleanor stood to face the consequences of her actions. The transformation in Thomas was remarkable. Clear-eyed and alert now that the medications had left his system, he looked every bit the successful businessman he always been. Guilty on all counts, the judge's voice rang through the courtroom. Eleanor's shoulders slumped slightly, her perfect posture finally breaking. The sentence came down hard. 15 years in prison for fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The judge's words were sharp, condemning her betrayal of a 3-decade marriage for simple greed. Robert Wilson received 8 years for his role in the scheme, his cooperation with prosecutors earning him a lighter sentence. The mansion sale was completely reversed, all assets returned to Thomas' control. The money trail Eleanor had tried so hard to hide was untangled, every missing dollar traced and recovered. Back at the mansion, Thomas and James walked through the familiar rooms together. The new furniture the buyers had started moving in was gone, but many family pieces had been recovered from storage. James watched as his father ran his hand along the study desk where he built his business empire, the wood smooth and familiar under his fingers. "It's strange," Thomas said quietly, looking out the study window at the garden. "For months, I felt like I was drowning in fog, questioning my own mind. Now everything's clear again, but I keep wondering how I didn't see it coming." James squeezed his father's shoulder, understanding the pain behind those words. The recovery process wasn't just about property and assets. Thomas threw himself into rebuilding his business relationships, many of which had been damaged during his forced absence. Old friends and business partners, now understanding what had really happened, rallied around him. His first major development project after returning to work was his most successful yet. The house staff gradually returned, bringing life back to the quiet rooms. The cook prepared Thomas's favorite meals, no longer afraid to serve him coffee. The gardener replanted the rose bushes Eleanor had ordered removed, and the housekeeper restored family photos to their rightful places on the walls. James decided to move his work back to the States, taking a position that let him stay close to home. Father and son established new traditions: weekly dinners where they talked business and life, weekend golf games where they could simply enjoy each other's company. Their bond, tested by betrayal, had emerged stronger. The story made headlines, then gradually faded from the news. Eleanor's perfectly crafted image of the devoted wife was replaced by the truth: a calculating woman who had nearly destroyed her family for money. In prison, her expensive clothes exchanged for a standard uniform, she had time to reflect on the life she'd thrown away. Thomas received letters from other families who'd faced similar situations, thanking him for bringing attention to the issue of elder abuse and fraud. With James' encouragement, he began speaking at conferences, sharing their story to help others recognize the warning signs they'd missed. 1 year after the verdict, Thomas stood in the mansion's garden, surrounded by blooming roses and morning sunlight. The property that Eleanor had tried to steal away had become a symbol of recovery and renewal. The fountain burbled peacefully, and through the open windows came the sounds of the house staff preparing breakfast. James joined his father in the garden, carrying 2 cups of coffee, properly prepared this time. They sat on the patio furniture, enjoying the morning peace. Their conversations no longer centered on Eleanor's betrayal, but looked toward the future instead. They discussed business plans, family gatherings, and the possibility of James starting his own branch of the company. The mansion stood proud against the morning sky, its windows reflecting the sunrise. Inside and out, signs of Eleanor's deception had been erased, replaced by new memories and plans for the future. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed their family had ultimately failed, defeated by a son's determination to uncover the truth and a father's strength in recovering from it. Life would never be exactly the same, but perhaps it wasn't meant to be. Through the darkness of betrayal, Thomas and James had discovered a stronger bond, a deeper trust, and a renewed appreciation for the truth. Their story, though marked by pain, had become one of resilience, justice, and the unbreakable connection between father and son.